The cameras had barely begun to roll when the room was struck silent by the weight of anticipation. World leaders, journalists, and citizens watching from every corner of the globe leaned forward in their seats. They were expecting a polite diplomatic exchange. Instead, what they witnessed felt more like history cracking open in real time. It began with a single sentence, carried on Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady, unflinching, and brimming with conviction. Her words cut through the stale air of political formalities like lightning across a stormy sky. In that moment, the polished scripts and carefully rehearsed talking points that usually dominate such gatherings evaporated. What remained was raw, human truth, a truth that no one in that room, not even President Ibrahim Traoré himself, was prepared for. The impact was instantaneous. Eyebrows shot up, hands froze mid-note. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether they were capturing diplomacy or destiny. President Traoré, known for his unwavering composure and defiance on the global stage, found himself staring ahead, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and vulnerability. For the first time, the man who had built his reputation on unshakable resolve was visibly shaken. Not by threats, not by sanctions, but by the clarity of a single woman's voice. Viewers watching live across America, and far beyond, felt it too. Social media timelines erupted in real time. Hashtags ignited, reaction videos flooded in, and stunned commentators whispered that this was not just politics anymore. This was a turning point. A new kind of confrontation had just unfolded, one that wasn't about who could shout the loudest, but who could speak the deepest truth. And yet, this was only the beginning. What made Jasmine's opening so electrifying wasn't just the words themselves, but the silence they created. A silence heavy with questions, with challenge, with the undeniable sense that something larger was at play. For President Traoré, for America, for everyone listening, the unspoken thought hung in the air. If one sentence could shift the ground beneath their feet, what would come next? The answer was coming, and it would leave not just a president, but an entire nation reeling in ways no one could predict it. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, brimming with questions no one dared to speak aloud. What had begun as a routine diplomatic exchange was now something far more volatile. The entire atmosphere had shifted. The clash was no longer just about Jasmine and President Ibrahim Traoré. It was about two visions of leadership colliding head-on before a world that was desperate for answers. For Traoré, this moment carried a different kind of weight. He had earned his reputation as a firebrand, a man who stood tall against global superpowers and refused to bend under pressure. To his supporters, he was a symbol of resistance and pride. To his critics, he was stubborn and dangerously uncompromising. That dual image had always worked in his favor. But Jasmine Crockett's words cut through both perceptions. She wasn't attacking his politics. She was questioning something deeper, the heart behind the power. And for America, the stakes were even higher. This wasn't just about what was said in one meeting. It was about what the moment represented on a larger scale. Whether compassion could still outshine confrontation, whether dignity could still pierce through arrogance. Millions were watching, not for policy points or diplomatic jargon, but for truth. They were tired of leaders hiding behind polished phrases. They craved authenticity, and Jasmine had just given them a glimpse of it. In that glimpse, a dangerous possibility emerged. If her words had the power to shake even Ibrahim Traoré, what ripple effects would follow? Would his supporters see vulnerability as weakness? Would the world interpret his hesitation as defeat? Or would this be the spark of a different kind of conversation, one rooted in humanity rather than defiance? The tension hung like a storm waiting to break. Everyone knew Traoré's next move could either reclaim the room or surrender entirely. And yet, there was also a sense that no matter how he responded, something irreversible had already happened. Jasmine had shifted the stage. She had turned what was expected to be another display of power politics into a test of conscience. The world braced itself, knowing the confrontation was far from over, because the next exchange would either explode into chaos or crystallize into history. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words struck so deeply, one must look at a man who now sat in silence, President Ibrahim Traoré. He had risen to power not through quiet diplomacy, but through defiance. In the heart of Burkina Faso, where frustration with corruption and foreign meddling boiled over, Traoré emerged as the young soldier who dared to challenge the old order. At just 34, he became Africa's youngest leader, carrying himself with the pride of a man who believed destiny had chosen him. His speeches thundered against Western exploitation, against hypocrisy, against what he saw as the arrogance of nations who preached democracy but practiced dominance. Crowds adored him. They called him a lion, a protector of African dignity. To his people, he was the answer to decades of humiliation. But to the world beyond, his rise looked far less heroic. Critics painted him as reckless, driven by ego, wielding his youth not as inspiration, but as defiance without discipline. That tension defined Traoré's image. He was either a visionary or a villain, rarely anything in between. And in that stark division, he thrived. The stronger the criticism, the more his supporters rallied. The more he was dismissed abroad, the more he was celebrated at home. His entire political life had been built on that paradox. He didn't need the approval of the world as long as he had the loyalty of his people. Yet, in this moment, Jasmine Crockett's sentence had pierced through that armor. Unlike foreign presidents or journalists who dismissed him, she hadn't attacked his legitimacy or accused him of tyranny. She had asked him to confront the very thing he claimed to defend: humanity, dignity, compassion. And suddenly, the man who was used to fighting giants with speeches and defiance found himself disarmed by a question of conscience. This was the paradox of Ibrahim Traoré. The more he fought to prove himself invincible, the more fragile the image became when faced with truth that couldn't be silenced. And now the world was watching to see if the lion would roar back or falter. Before Jasmine Crockett stood in that chamber, staring down one of the most defiant leaders in the world, she was no stranger to struggle. Her story wasn't written in the polished language of privilege, but in the unyielding rhythm of survival and purpose. Born and raised in Texas, Jasmine carried the weight of two Americas, one that promised freedom and opportunity, and another that demanded she fight twice as hard for respect, for dignity, for the right to be heard. Her parents instilled in her the idea that silence was never an option. They taught her that the measure of a life was not in comfort, but in courage, the willingness to speak when voices were trembling, to stand when knees were weak. This seed of defiance grew into a calling. Jasmine pursued law, not as a path to wealth, but as a shield for the vulnerable. In courtrooms, she became known for her fire, her unwillingness to bow to intimidation, and her relentless drive to hold power accountable. That drive propelled her into public service. When Jasmine entered politics, she did not arrive with the pedigree of dynasties or the blessing of elites. She came as the daughter of a community that had been overlooked and underestimated. Every speech she gave was laced with the echo of those who came before her, who fought battles she could not ignore. She carried their stories like armor, and in doing so, she became more than a representative. She became a symbol of resistance, of identity, of a new America refusing to remain silent. Her clashes in Congress became legendary, not because she sought confrontation, but because she refused to yield to it. Whether it was defending immigrants, protecting voting rights, or calling out hypocrisy, Jasmine embodied a kind of political courage rarely seen. Sharp, unfiltered, unapologetic. To her supporters, she wasn't just a politician. She was a mirror of their own frustrations and dreams. She was proof that authenticity could still survive in a system built on calculation. And so, when Jasmine walked into that meeting with Ibrahim Traoré, she didn't come armed with diplomatic scripts or the careful neutrality that defines political theater. She came with the same truth she had always carried: to speak directly, to cut through arrogance, to remind those in power that leadership without humanity is not leadership at all. That was her weapon, not an army, not an institution, but a voice that could turn silence into revelation. And it was this voice, honed by years of struggle and sharpened by the weight of responsibility, that left a man like Traoré, a man who prided himself on defiance, suddenly speechless. But if Jasmine's strength was in her voice, the real test was yet to come. Because as history shows, moments of truth rarely end with silence. They explode into escalation, and the next move would determine whether this confrontation broke into chaos or transformed into something unforgettable. The room shifted as the air thickened with tension. What began as polite diplomatic sparring now trembled on the edge of confrontation. President Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his voice carrying the heavy weight of defiance. "America," he said sharply, "has no right to lecture us on dignity. You preach freedom, yet your hands are stained with hypocrisy." His words echoed, laced with the arrogance of a man who believed he had cornered his opponent. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others tightened their jaws. Traoré's presence was commanding, almost theatrical, but behind the bravado there lingered an unmistakable arrogance. He spoke not only to Jasmine but to the world, daring her to falter. Jasmine sat still, her posture calm, her eyes locked on him with the quiet intensity of someone who had heard such rhetoric all her life. She let the words hang, let the silence grow heavier, and in that silence, she gathered the room into the palm of her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it cut like a blade. "You speak of hypocrisy, Mr. President. But tell me, what is greater hypocrisy? A nation struggling with its flaws, fighting to overcome them, or a leader who hides his failures behind fiery speeches, while his people cry out for bread, for dignity, for hope?" The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Traoré's confident smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough to betray the hit. For the first time, the clash felt uneven. He tried to recover, pounding the table with his palm. "You don't understand our struggle. You can't dictate what justice looks like in our land." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady, every word landing like a stone in still water. "You're right. I don't dictate justice in your land. But I do recognize when leaders turn justice into theater while their people starve. And I refuse to remain silent when arrogance is dressed as strength." The escalation peaked. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The clash no longer a simple exchange, but a duel of values. Pride versus truth, arrogance versus dignity. Traoré raised his chin, ready to hurl another accusation, but Jasmine cut in, and it was then that the moment transformed. Her words came slow, deliberate, as if chosen from a place deeper than politics. Power is not measured by how loudly a man speaks, but by whether his people thrive when he is done speaking. History does not remember the noise. It remembers the lives lifted, the dignity restored, the freedom secured. So I ask you, Mr. President, when history writes your name, what will your people say? That you shouted the loudest, or that you delivered them justice? The chamber froze. For a brief, electric second, it was as though the air itself had been sucked away. Ibrahim Traoré's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes flickered, searching for a retort. But Jasmine's words had landed not as an insult, but as a truth too sharp to dismiss. The silence became deafening. It was not Jasmine's victory dance, not a show of smugness. It was her restraint, her ability to let truth stand unaccompanied. That destroyed him. She had given the chamber not a debate, but a mirror, and in that mirror, his defiance dissolved into something fragile. Whispers began to rise from the gallery. A reporter scribbled furiously. Phones lit up as aides texted updates. It was more than a rebuttal. It was a dismantling, a revelation that turned the supposed villain into a figure suddenly smaller, diminished before the weight of truth. Jasmine sat back, her face calm, her presence unshaken. She had not raised her voice. She had not flung insults. She had spoken with the authority of lived struggle, of someone who knew that power without service was a hollow crown. And yet, even in this silence, the battle was not fully over. Because silence in politics is not the end. It is the spark. The room waited, holding its collective breath, wondering what ripple this clash would unleash outside those walls. Would it end in humiliation for Traoré? Would it ignite fury across the globe? Or would it inspire something larger, a reckoning about what true leadership looks like? One thing was certain. Jasmine Crockett had not just debated. She had dismantled, and the world would not forget the sound of a leader silenced by the truth. The silence in that chamber was only the spark. The real fire erupted outside. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's words were everywhere. Clips of her calm yet devastating takedown flooded Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, each replay gathering millions of views. Hashtags like #CrockettTruth and #SilencingArrogance trended across continents. Commentators scrambled to define the moment. This wasn't debate, one analyst declared on MSNBC. This was truth, sharp enough to strip arrogance bare. On CNN, panelists replayed her final line. When history writes your name, what will your people say? Slowing it down, dissecting it, acknowledging the weight it carried. In Burkina Faso, state-controlled media tried to mute the moment, trimming broadcasts to exclude Jasmine's words. But the people had already seen it. WhatsApp groups buzzed with subtitled clips. Teachers discussed it with students. Merchants and markets repeated it like a proverb. She spoke the truth, spread from lips to lips until it became impossible to suppress. For many, it wasn't about America versus Africa. It was about dignity versus arrogance, justice versus ego. And in Washington, whispers traveled quickly. Some lawmakers dismissed it as theatrics, but others recognized what had happened. Jasmine had seized global attention without raising her voice. She had turned restraint into power, silence into a weapon, and truth into a force no spin could contain. But this moment was more than victory. It was a mirror. A question had been thrown not just at Ibrahim Traoré, but at every leader, every system, every citizen. What will your people say when history writes your name? The world had witnessed arrogance silenced, but the ripple of what came next was only beginning. In the days that followed, the noise of politics slowly faded, but Jasmine Crockett's words lingered like an echo across continents. What struck people wasn't just the boldness of her statement. It was the truth embedded within it. She reminded the world that power is temporary, but legacy is eternal. Leaders may control armies, resources, or headlines, but none can control how history will remember them. That reminder cut through arrogance and spoke to something deeper. The human need for dignity, the desire to be remembered for lifting others up, not tearing them down. For countless immigrants, progressives, and marginalized voices, Jasmine's stand became more than a viral clip. It was validation. It was proof that truth, when spoken with conviction, has the power to shake even the most unshakable thrones. She had not just offended herself. She had defended the idea that justice, compassion, and identity are not weaknesses but the foundation of real strength. And as the world reflected, one thing became clear. Her words weren't just meant for one man in one room. They were meant for all of us. A challenge, a reminder, and a promise that history is always listening. And so, as the dust settled, one truth could no longer be denied. Jasmine Crockett had done what few dared to attempt. She stood in the face of power, spoke with clarity, and left not only President Traoré but an entire nation stunned. Her words traveled far beyond that chamber, sparking debates in living rooms, classrooms, and parliaments worldwide. This wasn't just a political exchange. It was a reminder that courage in the right moment can rewrite the story of history. But here's the part that matters most. This moment doesn't end with her. It continues with you. Every time you share these stories, every time you amplify these voices, you become part of the ripple that carries dignity further than arrogance ever could. Because when truth speaks, it is never alone. It gathers strength, community, and change. That's why we built this channel, to give these stories a stage, to make sure voices like Jasmine Crockett's are never silenced, and lessons like these are never forgotten. So if you believe in justice, in courage, and in the power of truth, join us. Subscribe to Argument Arena, share this message, and be part of the movement.